At the end of his 1965 song, "It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding," Bob Dylan expresses the apprehension many of us feel to tell the world what we really think. He sings, "And if my thought dreams could be seen, they'd probably put my head in a guillotine." We walk around in the world perceiving and judging, seizing safe moments, spaces, and ears in which to let out opinions we ought not or cannot share more widely. In the church, the virtuous Christian is on guard lest an errant thought veer into gossip or calumny, or simply be misheard, misperceived, or taken out of context in a way that creates a stumbling block to another's growth in the faith. Additionally, whether in the church, the military, or a corporation, hierarchical structures sometimes discourage speaking up, or at least speaking plainly, for fear of jeopardizing one's livelihood and future prospects. But as those who frequent the sacrament of reconciliation know, there can be no Godward change without first bringing the truth to light. And at times, the faithful must take risks to say what must be said, to speak from the depth of experience about matters that everyone is thinking about, but few know what to do about. Francis X. Maier has worked for decades both in journalism, as the editor-in-chief of the National Catholic Register, and in diocesan ministry, as a senior aide and special assistant to Archbishop Charles Chaput in both Denver and Philadelphia. And he recently set out to ask questions and get straight answers from a large group of clergy and lay people with candid, informed opinions about the church. Posing questions about the challenges and opportunities facing the culture, clerical celibacy, church hierarchy, church finances, the sex abuse scandals, and so many other timely topics, Maier gathered answers in a page-turning new book appropriately named True Confessions, Voices of Faith from a Life in the Church, now available from Ignatius Press. Under the assurance of anonymity, bishops comment with candor that is as refreshing as it is unusual about all manner of topics. Most everyone else, priests, deacons, theologians, leaders of apostolates, big donors, and others, all go on the record with equally provocative comments, but all rooted in charity and genuine desire for the flourishing of Christ's church. As it happens, when one has the courage to speak the truth in love, the blade of Bob Dylan's feared guillotine rarely falls. Towards the end of True Confessions, Fran Maier treats readers to a bit of backstory about his early life in the film business, and then he adds his own analysis and insights about the challenges and opportunities facing Christian communities today, inviting each reader to a personal conversion that is the starting point to any discussion of a renewed Catholic Church. Fran Maier is now a senior fellow in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and it is my pleasure to speak to him today, right here on the Ignatius Press podcast. Fran Maier, welcome to the Ignatius Press podcast. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Andrew. Thank you.
Well, I am very glad to be talking to you today because I very much enjoyed your new book, which we'll be discussing today. And the book is called True Confessions, Voices of Faith from a Life in the Church. Now, Fran, this is an unusual book in a good way, I would say, because what you've done is you've collected a series of interviews with different kinds of people with stakes in the church, bishops, priests, all different kinds of lay people. And you've also added your own kind of commentary here and there, both at the beginning and the end, and at the beginning of each chapter from your extensive experience as a leader in the church. So I guess my first question for you is, how and when did it occur to you to go out into the field, as it were, and collect all of these precious words that you could share with the rest of the church?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it wasn't my intention originally. My intention was to write toward the end of a career, kind of like the grand analysis of the church in the United States. But it occurred to me that most of the commentary that I've read in the Catholic chattering class, including my own, by the way, most of my own opinions are kind of boring because they just get toxic and conflict oriented. So I thought, well, instead of talking about what people might think, why don't I go out and actually ask people what they do think? And so that's the reason it took the direction it did. As you know, I interviewed about little over 100 people, including 30 bishops and clergy of all sorts, and then mainly lay people, because that was the primary focus, is what lay Catholics in the United States think. And it just turned into a very interesting and frank series of conversations with people who are truly faithful, truly trying to live their faith, but also critical in loving ways of problems in the church. I was particularly interested in the interviews with bishops because, I worked with them for, well over 2 decades, and even before that when I was an editor. And I had a very positive view of them. But when you get them to actually speak frankly instead of necessarily prudently, they really reveal who they are. And I was able to do that because I gave them anonymity, which allowed them to relax and actually say what they thought. And they're just terrific guys. I mean, they all have different skill sets, different personalities, different life experiences, but overall, they're just really dedicated men. And I hope people who read the book will get that impression that they're being led by good men who are doing their best.
Yeah, well, it seems at least the men that you interviewed come across as good men. And, I thought that was an interesting and I think important decision that you made, Fran, to provide anonymity to the bishops, whereas the other people you interviewed were happy, I guess, to
Yes.
make themselves known. But, I suppose a lot of us out in the church just sometimes maybe get frustrated because bishops are such high profile and political figures, that they can't really say what they think.
They have to be prudent. They have to be prudent. And I don't think people understand that, Andrew, adequately, because what they say will be parsed and picked apart by a lot of people who are hostile or don't understand the faith. And so they've got to be careful. And what that can lead to is a perception of a lack of courage. And in some cases, it's true. Some bishops do lack courage, but most are, again, they're trying to do their best in very difficult circumstances.
Yeah, and that really comes through in the comments that the bishops make. Maybe we could go into some of the categories that you wanted to discuss with them.
Yeah.
Let's start here. What were kind of the large scale challenges that the bishops articulated to you when you talked to them?
Well, in the immediate, I interviewed most of these guys in the immediate aftermath of COVID. So the very first question was, what did COVID do to your faith, to the faith of your people, and did they come back or not? And of course, it accelerated trends that are already happening in American culture, people going tepid or falling away. Another interesting element of the conversation that led to was the question of whether the supernatural really has staying power with people. I mean, do people in church actually believe in things like heaven and hell, in consequences for one's actions in this life? And the bishops were all over the lot in their judgment of that. I mean, Americans, we're living in the most materialist society in human history. And a lot of us experience our faith as a very positive ethical system. But most of us don't really believe that, A, we're going to die, or if we do die, that we couldn't possibly end up in any place but heaven, because after all, God is all loving. So we had some good conversations about that, some very practical questions about the utility of celibacy, questions about the impact of the abuse scandal. A lot of lay people are very uneasy about financial management in the church because, they work hard to make their money, and when they donate it, they want it used properly. So there's a whole chapter on the situation in Philadelphia, which was really a catastrophe when Archbishop Chaput got to Philadelphia. And it was a catastrophe not because people were corrupt. It was a catastrophe because good people tried to do too many good things without adequate planning and safety mechanisms to ensure that things were done properly. Um, you know, a lot of questions about the life of priests and the nature of what the lay vocation actually means, because everybody talks about it, but what does it actually mean? What does it mean to be a lay leader? So the various vocations in the church that commented on that, from bishops to lay people, had slightly differing views. What you find, I hope I'm not kind of rambling here, but I mean, one of the things that struck me was the difference between the way bishops think about their relationship with priests and the way priests think about their relationship with bishops. There's a real gulf there that really tracks back to the abuse scandal and a sense of anxiety on the part of priests. So we were all over the lot. I had a list of about 25 questions that I went into every single interview with. And typically by question 5, that all got thrown out the window and they talked about what they wanted to. So it was quite a ride.
Yeah, sticking with bishops for a minute, because your comments there were so helpful, because it's clear how the first part of the book where you're talking to bishops really opens up into all the other conversations that you have with priests and deacons and others. But sticking with bishops for a minute, you mentioned that you talk to them about celibacy, you talk to them about church administration. You also talk to them about politics and culture. And that's an area where we faithful out in the pews, where there's always a lot of confusion about, what does the bishop think about this, or what does the bishop think about that? What can a bishop say? What can a bishop do, right? For example, about whether a politician can be barred from communion or something like that. What did you hear from the bishops that you talked to about kind of the cultural and political issues and the church's understanding of what all that's about?
Well, I think most of them are very well aware that we tried too hard to assimilate into this country, and in the process we got digested by it. So that when we talk about the Catholic vote, it's virtually non-existent now. Politics is always going to have a moral dimension because it's about the acquisition and the use of power. So we have to be politically engaged as a people. The bishops, of course, are constrained from, except in extreme circumstances, from directing people to a particular candidate. Privately, I thought there was a dislike for different reasons directed at both Trump and Biden. I mean, Trump did a lot of good things, but he's perceived as a narcissist and much too self-focused, whereas Biden is nominally Catholic, but effectively off the reservation in terms of his views. I mean, there's very little real Catholic conviction in what he's doing. So the bishops were deeply skeptical of the political system at this point, and not particularly hopeful about the future. We just have to do what we can with the resources that we've got, and that's pretty much their attitude. Culturally, as I indicated a few minutes ago, I think they're very conscious that we're dealing with and living in a country that has kind of a veneer of respect for religion and a veneer of democratic institutions, but is actually the most materialist culture in history. And our institutions, in some ways, are vestigial because the country's so big and administration is so difficult that the democratically elected elements of of constitutional government are being kind of delegated away to these administrative agencies, and that's always a source of some anxiety. So it's a, if you don't know history, Andrew, we're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
And one of the problems that Catholics have in America is a forgetfulness, because we're a novus ordo seclorum, a new order of the ages, and we don't like the past, because the past is kind of a mortgage on us being able to recreate ourselves. But that's toxic for Catholics, because history is our rootedness as a believing people. So if you were to ask me, Fran, what are the things that would lead to a real renewal of the church? I mean, one of them is obviously confession on a regular basis. Another is adoration, because we need to recover a sense of interior life, and adoration forces you to do that. And then just trying to live your life as a saint. It sounds so difficult and so simple at the same time, but I mean, doing the right thing on a daily basis as a Catholic is increasingly difficult in this culture. And that's the only way things are going to turn around, because we behaved ourselves into this series of problems that we've got. And there's no quick fix for them. We have to behave ourselves out of them and become saints,
Yeah, and I think that longing for, maybe that sadness about the lack of a virtuous society comes through in the bishop's words. Last thing on bishops, because there's so many other interesting groups of people I want to talk about, but I can't resist asking you about this, because of course, being, excuse me, for the bishops to be anonymous allowed them to express certain misgivings, perhaps, about Pope Francis. And I just want to read one quick quote. One of them said, "Francis fosters ambiguity, which feeds division. His distaste for the United States and its bishops is obvious and unwarranted. His manner is authoritarian."
Yes.
And a number of the bishops expressed, even anonymously, you could tell some of them were trying to be careful, but it was pretty illuminating to see some real opinions expressed there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Look, the overall, and I mean about all of the bishops that I talked to, would necessarily be ranked as faithful guys. I mean, these are guys who are committed to Rome, committed to the Pope. But, in a marriage, spouses are frank with one another, and the bishops have an obligation to tell the truth. And so the general feeling of the bishops toward Pope Francis is one of some confusion and some frustration. There's also people in the interviews with bishops who were clearly supportive of Francis, really making an effort to, clearly support the man to the degree that they could. But you mentioned one bishop. There was another bishop who described him as ruthless 3 times in a row. I eliminated 2 of them in editing the text, but I mean a real sense of a perception that the Pope is the most authoritarian Pope in the last century, which I think arguably is true in his manner. I saw that at the 2015 Synod. So the bishops are faithful sons of the Church and faithful to the Pope, but not without a certain degree of puzzlement and criticism. And that comes through in the interviews, I think.
Yeah. And likewise, if we move on to the next category of priests, you alluded to this before, but the priests have a distrust, maybe an ambiguity anyway, toward the hierarchy themselves, and not just the Pope, but their own bishops and other priests, maybe even. What was that like? Talking to the priests about their relationship with their bishops and the wider church.
Well, when there's a dysfunction between the priests that I talked to directly, who were very careful in their criticism of their bishop. But then the survey that I mentioned by my colleague Steve White at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which demonstrates very clearly the priests have a real hard time trusting their bishops because of the abuse scandal. So the priests that I interviewed tended to be, with the exception of Father Phil Leray, who is pretty direct in his comments. When he was teaching at the Pontifical Lateran University, I interviewed him. He's now at Boston College. But he was very respectful, but also very frank in that priests have a hard time trusting their bishops because of the abuse scandal. I think some of that, Andrew, is just hardwired into the nature of the relationship, because a bishop is, a father and a brother to his priest, but he's also practically the boss. And the boss is always a potential problem looming on the horizon. So, there's always that tension. It's just gotten worse since the abuse crisis. because they feel like they've been too often cut loose, or they may get cut loose at any minute if somebody makes an allegation.
Yeah. But that having been said, I mean, despite various challenges, the priests that you interviewed seemed very, for the most part, I thought very, very convicted about their vocation. I mean, very happy to be priests and happy to be celibate. They all spoke very eloquently about the celibate vocation, and that was encouraging to me. I hope that comes through to everyone who reads the book.
Yeah, I think so. I know both of, or I know all of the priests that I interviewed previously. I knew Father Leray when he was working in pastoral work here in the United States, and now he's back, as I indicated. But Eric Banneker is a fantastic young priest in the inner city, and just if you want encouragement about the future of the church, he's a poster boy for it, because I mean there are a lot of guys like him out there. He's got a difficult parish, poor parish, and he's just loaded with energy, and so source of a great deal of and he's very, very sharp. I think that comes through in the interview as well. He's really a very intelligent guy. And then there's Father Brownholtz, who's kind of a mid-career pastor in a suburban parish, one of 7 kids, comes from a devout family. You know, the parish he was in was literally dying on the vine. He showed up, and 3 years later, it was completely alive again. You know, which is an indicator of how powerful the witness of a pastor can be. So, yeah, they were both. Neither of them expressed any criticism of their bishop, by the way. So I got more frankness on that in that territory from the permanent deacons I talked with. You know, Deacon Chris Roberts and Deacon Mike Sabanko are really good examples of guys who are thoroughly committed, but also very direct in what their comments are. You know.
Yeah, I was impressed with Christopher Roberts' comments, and I have noted here that he described he used the term lethargic mediocrity, which I thought was that was quite a phrase.
Well, you know, Chris is the son of a very prominent Baptist pastor, and he was on an academic track. He wrote a book on Christian sexuality that's very good. When he was, I think it's kind of his PhD doctoral thesis, you know, turned into a book, and then he just got he got repeated invitations to consider the permanent diaconate, and finally jumped into it. You know.
Yeah.
So.
Well, one more thing about him. I mean, he makes it clear he wishes there was more theological discussion happening. Yeah. And there are some, you know, there is a case to be made, perhaps, that even though bishops are overwhelmed with the administrative apparatus that they are thrust into, that there may be something to be said for them to really embrace their first love, which surely they didn't become priests and bishops because they wanted to run an institution. I mean, it was because they loved Jesus, they loved the Lord, they loved God's people, and probably they were pretty fascinated with the Bible and the theological tradition, and you know, that ought to maybe come through more.
Yeah, well, you know, I think Catholics have an instinctive understanding of this if they have been around a while. You know, I mean, guys enter the priesthood like men and women enter marriage. They have an idea in their head, and then the reality isn't exactly what they expected. You know, I mean, you know, you may love your wife, but that comes with mortgage and kids and education and massive costs and everything. And like guys who enter the priesthood tend to do it because they feel the mission of preaching the word of God. And then all of a sudden, somewhere in their career, they are ending up running a small corporation, you know, which is what a parish is. So it can be daunting.
Yeah, well, let's carry that forward then, Fran, with the next set of interviews you did with colleagues and friends and others who are involved in diocesan leadership. Your chapter is called "The Machinery and Its Fixing," and maybe we could start with the financial aspect. You brought that up before, but you know, you mentioned the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, and I know that this will apply to so many other places in the church where there are just, you know, big big problems, big messes, lots of questions. What do we do? And the interviews that you conducted, I think, shed a lot of light on some of the problems, but also some of the ways forward. Maybe you could talk about that.
Oh yeah. Well, a little bit of background is useful. When Archbishop Chaput moved from Denver to Philadelphia, he brought two people with him. I'm one of them, and Carrie Kober, who is his longtime personal secretary, terrific consecrated virgin, wonderful woman. So the two of us moved with him, and he knew going in that the church in Philadelphia had serious problems in terms of clergy abuse, which then led to significant legal issues, political issues, broken, priestly morale. It was a very difficult environment. What he didn't know is that we were also $300 million in debt and had been running budget deficits of, over $10 million for years. So it was a financial catastrophe. And again, with the exception of a CFO who happened to make off with $1 million, that was an extra added bonus. Most of the problems were created by good people trying to maintain institutions and offices that were dead and had been dead for a long time. The church in the East, all along the Eastern Seaboard, is going through this contraction process, and how you handle that to right-size the church in the new circumstances is difficult and frankly distressing. So people don't want to do it. But if you don't do it, then there's no future. So the first 3 or 4 years that the Archbishop was here in Philadelphia were really very, very, very difficult because of closing things that people had an emotional attachment to that was out of proportion to reality. But it had to be done. And when it was done, everybody breathed a lot easier, and the church is much healthier than it was 10 years ago now because of it in the diocese. So, realism in the way that we administer the church is absolutely essential to keep the confidence of the faithful, because sooner or later they're going to figure out that something's wrong and you didn't fix it. And that chapter, one of the great gifts of the Archbishop was that he knew how to recruit really good people and then allow them to do their job and hold them accountable for it at the same time. So the two CFOs that I interviewed, Dave Holden and Tim O'Shaughnessy, both came from very distinguished corporations and corporate backgrounds that they didn't need to do this work. They did it because they loved the church. And the two of them just turned it around with the help of an extremely gifted attorney, Scott Browning, who has represented the Archbishop for now decades, and who isn't Catholic, by the way, but is very devoted to the church. So it was just, I staffed the process, and it was just fascinating for me to see these guys work and the Archbishop work in a way that really served the interests of the church.
Yeah. That lawyer, I really liked, excuse me again, I really liked the interview that you did with him. And I was especially interested in his reflection on where we are now legally and just sort of with regard to administration and stuff with regard to the sex.
You're just dropping out. Andrew. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Right.
Okay. I apologize. We'll edit that.
Okay.
We'll edit that. Yeah. So the lawyer that you mentioned a moment ago, who's not Catholic, I really appreciated his perspective on where we are in regard to, the kind of the aftermath of the clergy abuse scandals, and kind of what the church is facing in terms. There was a kind of a initial period, and now we're into a different period. And not to say that, it's all still alive. And I think we're probably going to be generations until we're really realizing the impact of all of that. But just from his perspective as a lawyer, as somebody who's working with the diocese, he had some interesting things to say. What did he share with you?
A couple of things. The number one, and again, remember this, Scott's not Catholic. I mean, he is a Methodist. He's a Christian, but he's not a Catholic. His attitude was that, first of all, it's not just a Catholic problem. That's as obvious as can be. We got a lot of attention because we're a real big organization. But the problem is pandemic in this culture, and in many ways worse in some public school districts and public institutions. So that's the first thing. Once you realize that, you're not just going to simply demonize the church as a layperson. The other thing is that it's big business. I mean, what's happened is that plaintiffs' attorneys really understood that this was a gold mine, and they emptied the coffers of a lot of dioceses in an excessive way. And a lot of the money, he also makes this point, 40 or 50 cents of every dollar in those settlements that the church made with plaintiffs' attorneys went to the attorneys and not to the victims. So Scott's attitude was that a system has to be developed that kind of cuts out a lot of the plaintiffs' attorneys and pays to heal the actual victims, if that can be done. And that's why these reparation funds that a number of dioceses, including the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, have been successful and actually worked, because the money doesn't go to attorneys, the money goes to victims. And that's the purpose of making up for the evil that was done for these people, not enriching, plaintiffs' attorneys. What else did he say that was useful? I mean, I think he's very disturbed by the drift in American culture against religious liberty and the increasing frustrations that are imposed on Catholics and other religious organizations, because as religious belief declines, the value of religious freedom is going to decline, and he's very worried about that. But overall, I think the thing that emerges from that interview with Scott is, here's an outsider who's seen it all. I mean, all the dirty laundry, all the sensitive issues, and he just loves the church. He's absolutely committed to the church and believes in her goodness. And that was always a source of tremendous hope for me working with him. And Scott's a very good friend. That it just reassured me, or confirmed me in my own confidence in the church, which has really never changed.
Yeah, that came through in his remarks for sure. And it did also in the next set of interviews you did with various lay people, academics, people who are kind of invested in the teaching aspect of the church, men and women. And there were two. I wanted to highlight one woman and one man. There was one woman who is you describe as a wife, mother, and university professor. And she talks about a scene where she's meeting with a young man who's in his early 20s. You know exactly the one. Why don't you take over, since you know exactly the one I'm talking about? So sure. Tell us about that one.
Well, this is a woman who's a very gifted theologian, university professor, and teaching at a mainline university in a big city. And instead of teaching theology, or in addition to teaching theology, she has found herself needing to arrange dates for her students, because she's dealing with people who are in their late teens and their early 20s who've never been on a date. They don't know how to do it. And she said her office hours are jammed with people not asking questions about, the Trinity, but basically wanting to talk about their love lives, which are a wreck because they don't know how to conduct it. So one of her exercises is getting people to go out on a date, a real date, and then coming back and writing a report on it, so they can't escape the obligation of actually having to talk with one another. It's a strange world out there. I didn't have this problem.
Yeah, it does seem to have hit us all of a sudden, but it's refreshing that there are people in the church who have this almost sort of, we might call like a practical humanist vocation, to kind of help these young people become human beings, which is, after all, what Christ and the church is all about, in a sense.
Well, Andrew, one of her real concerns, and it's just mentioned at the very end of her comments, I think, is that one of the trends in higher education is more women entering higher education and fewer men. And her main concern is what that's going to do to family ecology, because the marriageable pool of men is shrinking for these women in highly educated positions, and the role relationship in a marriage then becomes out of joint from a Christian perspective. I mean, women exercise their authority in one way, men in another, and men are not supposedly, men are the head of a family, but what that actually means is a headship of service. If men are allowed to be drones and underachievers, it all just begins falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
Which goes to another issue that is explored somewhere in the book, which is the crisis of fatherhood, crisis
Mm-hmm.
of masculinity. That's we talk an awfully lot about feminism, but the deeper crisis is, and one of the bishops mentions this, by the way, the deeper crisis is a kind of crisis of masculinity and the emergence of men who don't know how to be men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was the other example I wanted to put to you, but you basically already said it. You talked to a man whom you describe as a husband, father, and lay ministry leader who talks about the urgent need for a healthy masculinity,
Yeah.
and that's seems to me the key, the healthy masculinity, because we see this longing in our culture for that men are kind of awakening and wanting to be manly and masculine, but maybe it's not being channeled in exactly the right way into the kind of servant leadership that you talked about before.
Oh, there's a real and disturbing trend toward I don't know what it's called at the moment. I mean, I've heard the expression Bronze Age masculinity, Nietzschean kind of stuff, which really posits masculinity as a kind of a hostile alternative force to feminism, and that just doesn't lead anywhere. First of all, it's stupid. I mean, it's emotionally unsatisfying. And it just isn't what men are made for. Men are meant to protect and provide for families and for other people. And when you're all about yourself and getting what you want, it just is a dead end, and it creates a lot of havoc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe that leads to the next category. You interviewed a number of families who have children with special needs, and there were various members of the church who are a category of Christian that is that has a special identity, I suppose, physically with regard to abilities and that sort of thing. And one of the couples you talked to was J.D. Flynn, whom our listeners probably will know as the editor of the Pillar, and also his wife Kate. What did they tell you, and what did the other families tell you about kind of the state of the church with regard to people with disabilities, or it's special people, I think that is the name of that chapter.
Right. Yeah. Well, JD and Kate are good friends, so it was an interesting conversation because they felt relaxed and very comfortable talking. But I mean, listeners need to understand that JD and Kate went out and wanted to adopt children with special needs. I mean, we have a son with special needs, but he's our natural son. So it's very easy to love him. The JD and Kate actually went out and actively chose to do that, and not just once but twice. So they're really a kind of heroism there. And the interesting thing about these people, Andrew, is that not just the Flynns, but also the Hennessy's and the McGurns, is that they don't see themselves as heroes. This is just routine Christian love. And that particular chapter is the one that always moves me the most.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think people hugely underestimate the kind of personal character that people need to do that sort of thing. I mean, the interview, JD and Kate are terrific because they're very frank. They all are, the other one that I can't read it without becoming affected by it is the one with Ursula and Matt Hennessy, You know, they have a really difficult circumstance with their daughter Magdalena, who has Down syndrome, but a lot of other problems as well that can lead to kind of impulsive anger and stuff like that. And it's really, really difficult. But they have an amazing, wholesome Christian attitude toward the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got, Julie and Bill McGurn, who adopted 3 infants from China when Bill was assigned to Hong Kong. Bill's got a great line about that he had to reconcile himself to being an ethnic and gender minority in his own family. He's got 3 girls who are Chinese with the last name of McGurn. So it's just they're just interesting people. I mean, Christians are interesting people when they live their faith.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, you said it before, just that the example of the really heroic Christian living that you see come through there, which, interestingly, you have another whole chapter about kind of successful ministries like apostolates and that kind of thing. Yeah. And I almost put those 2 chapters next to each other. Like, there's this sort of bigger scale sign of encouragement in the church. There are these, organizations that seem to be doing a lot of things well. But then there's also just this example of individuals and families who are just choosing to live as Catholics, just choosing to be the real deal. And both of them are just really encouraging. So I don't know if you want to say anything about those organizations.
Yeah, and when my wife and I have always been involved. Well, my wife particularly, I kind of ride her coattails on this. She taught for 40 years in Catholic schools, but she was also very active in the pro-life movement. So when we knew that there might be a problem with Dan, our son with Down syndrome, in utero, it didn't affect us. When he was born, it didn't really affect us. It was just something that we were mentally prepared for. I mean, it's always a bit of a challenge to actually live the convictions that you claim to believe, because, that's where the rubber meets the road. But it wasn't really that difficult. And he's a wonderful kid. But that was a gift to us. We didn't go out and search for it. I mean, when you run into that kind of witness, it's just very powerful.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your own witness, and it really comes through with the people that you talk to as well.
Well, they're likable people. The thing about the interviews that I did was that each one of them is a really interesting person.
Yeah.
I mean, and so you can't very well be depressed when you're dealing with all these really cool people who are committed and come from completely different perspectives. But they're all committed to the one thing, which is trying to live a faith that's very life-giving and organizes the purpose of their life, gives them meaning. And that's a pretty impressive. I mean, if people read the book, and I hope they will read it, and I hope they won't be deterred by the fact that, much of it is interviews. Some people don't like that. And I knew that going in, but I thought these people would be interesting enough that they would maintain that they would be worth the time of people investing in them. I think what you come away from is an inability to be depressed all the time. It's, if you look at the hard data about numbers and survey data about the church, you can very easily get lost in it and worry that, oh my goodness, it's all falling apart. Well, it isn't all falling apart. It's there are just too many good people, and that's how things are renewed. Andrew, one of the things that has marked my life was an interview. I called up a Jewish rabbi friend a few years ago and asked him just very simply, how is it that the Jewish people have survived all these centuries of persecution and dispersion and all sorts of challenges? And he said, gave me one word, Zachor. Zachor is Hebrew for remembering or memory,
Mm-hmm.
Jews are very committed to remembering who they are. And that gives them a resilience even under tremendous pressure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's our job too. You can't be too depressed about the church if you know it can be a whole lot worse.
Yeah.
Can get a whole lot worse. And we always come back because of people like the ones that I interviewed. I mean, these are people who just love the church and will not be deterred. And,
Yeah.
and so I came away from the whole process, A, exhausted, but B, very hopeful. I
Yeah.
thought that, okay, there's things aren't as bad as they might otherwise seem. They're actually seeds of renewal, even as we're speaking about problems in the church.
Yeah, and in fact, that's almost exactly what one of the people that you interviewed, Tim Bush of the Napa Institute, he said, we're already in a renewal process.
Yeah.
Which I thought that was, and several of the others in that chapter where you talk to people who invest their money in ministries and that sort of thing, they all seem to have that kind of positive outlook, really.
Yeah, well, Tim is compulsively positive, but for good reason. He's helped a lot of people do really, really good things and accomplish good things himself, obviously. But the investors, I call them the investors, the people who have resources and support really really important Catholic ministries, are interesting in their own right. What I was interested in talking to them was what motivates you to give away the money you work so hard to earn, and they're very articulate about that. But they're also very articulate about what their expectations are. And I think people who start ministries or want to do something for the Lord frequently think. I use the example of the Children's Crusade from I guess the 13th century, wonderful inspiration, terrific idea, no planning, completely falls apart, and apostolic leaders need to be responsible in terms of exercising good financial planning and control over the resources that other people give them. It goes back to the same thing we were talking about earlier in terms of the church. There's plenty of money out there, but you have to prove yourself before you get it, and then prove yourself to keep it in terms of the support of people who are committed to helping with their financial resources.
Yeah. Fran, one of the reasons I think people are going to like your book, I hope so anyway, is for me, it really hit home in your last chapter where you offer some of your own reflections. And we learned that you had worked in film. I'm a huge film person, so that was really really interesting. And even the title of your book, True Confessions, is taken from the 1981 film noir movie where Robert De Niro plays a priest. And but something I loved that you articulate so well in that last chapter is just how is really the power of story. That story is, in a sense, it is reality. I mean, all these stories that these people are telling you are reality, and they're conveying the truth of the gospel in a variety of different ways. And you say this, I'm just going to read this to you and then maybe ask for your reflection. You said, film done well has unique dramatic power. It's visual, absorbing, and immediate in its nature. Whatever truths it tells about the human condition linger a lot of time in the memory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, the visual is very powerful. I mean, their print and the visual image are two very different ways of communicating, and they each have particular strength. If you read something, I mean, if you read True Confessions, the book, you have one image, because it's based on a book originally, and it's a powerful novel, a murder mystery novel. But the movie has that kind of power, but then the additional power of fabulous actors delivering the message. I mean, Robert De Niro and Robert Duvall are two of the greatest actors of their generation, and that film has some of their very best work in their careers. And the reason that True Confessions is one of my all-time Catholic favorite movies. And I've had people say, what are you talking about? It's really a rough-edged kind of, in some ways, almost anti-Catholic picture. But it's not. finally, it's not about the institutional church or solving a murder mystery. Finally, it's about forgiveness between two brothers.
Yeah.
And that's extremely powerful. So that story, I think, goes to the heart of the Christian message. And again, in all of these interviews, there was that kind of willingness to love under very difficult circumstances and serious challenges to their ability to love. I mean, why would you put up with? I mean, from one perspective, I'm not saying this is my perspective, but why would you put up with Rome and some of its comments about the American church when you're doing your best to live the gospel and being told that you're not? I mean, I can see people being pretty angry about that. And I was impressed that anger was controlled so frequently by people who had every right to be annoyed. And they just kept doing what they're doing, One of the good things about Rome is that it's largely irrelevant, no matter who the Pope is in the daily life of Catholics. I mean, their pastor is the most important thing. Their bishop is the next important thing. And Rome is very far away, which is probably a good thing most of the time,
Yeah.
The function of the Pope is to be a source of unity, and you don't need that living in your house with you all the time, So
Right.
I just find at the end of it all, I find myself being, wondering if anybody will really be moved by it. But I certainly was, and I'm a skeptical guy. I mean, I'm a permanently glass half empty guy unless otherwise proven. So for me to be affected by these people, it proved to me that the message is true.
Yeah, and that will come through when our readers pick up the book. The book is True Confessions, Voices of Faith from a Life in the Church, available now from Ignatius Press, wherever you get your books. The author is Francis X. Maier. Fran, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks very much.